effects of the tariffs will be one-off, transitory. She also have said that perhaps they will give room for a number of firms to raise prices. You mentioned trials when washing machine prices went up because of tariffs. Dryer prices also went up in tandem, even though they weren't tariffs. What's your sense about the effects of tariffs on inflation? What would make them more persistent, and what would make them have effects on growth?
So in a kind of a simple starting point is that one tariff comes in that gets passed along in prices and raises inflation. It's just a one-time thing. So the price level goes up, and that's it. But that can happen in some circumstances. It depends on a number of things we don't know yet. I would point to three of them actually. One is just the size of the effects. As I mentioned, the tariffs are larger than forecasters had expected, certainly larger than we expected, even in our upside case. We looked at the range of cases. So that's one. The second one is how long does it take for the tariffs to have their effects on inflation? To the extent it takes longer and longer, that raises the risks that people will begin to experience higher inflation. They'll come to expect it, and companies will come to expect it. So that risks higher inflation. And the third is just what I mentioned in my speech, which is my remarks, which is got to keep inflation expectations well anchored. So if we have those three things under control, that's what it will take. And indeed, our role is to make sure that this will be a one-time increase in prices and not something that turns into an ongoing inflation process. That's a big part of our job.
What about the effects of tariffs on quantities? With the level of tariffs that, for example, have been currently applied on China, there's a fear that the supply chain may get disrupted, that firms may not be able to import their relevant stuff from China given the level of prices. If it turns into a supply shock, would the Fed's response be different than if it was primarily something which affected just prices?
So I actually had dinner at the Chicago Fed last night and with a number of directors of various parts of the Chicago Fed, and many of them are CEOs of significant companies, and they this uncertainty that they're feeling and the issue with imported components to their products is just a huge issue. But with if you look back at the pandemic, if you remember, there was a shortage of semiconductors, and that led to a shortage of cars at a time of extremely high car demand. And it was a prolonged shortage because production couldn't keep up. And that led to one of the things that led to an extended period of inflation. So when you think about supply disruptions, that is the kind of thing that can take time to resolve and lead what would have been a one-time inflation shock to be extended, perhaps more persistent, and we would worry about that. In this case, you can look at the car companies, which their supply chains are likely seen to be on track to be disrupted significantly, and you would worry that that process will take some years, and that the inflationary process might be extended. So these are all of this is highly uncertain. We're thinking now, really before the tariffs have their effects, how they might affect the economy, and that's why we're waiting really to see what the policies ultimately are, and then we can make a better assessment of what the economic effects will be.
Let's move to immigration. You talked about the labor markets being in reasonable equilibrium right now. Of course, what we've seen over the last few months, the last months of the previous administration continuing this administration, is immigration has fallen off considerably. What's your sense on how that will affect the labor market?
People went to work, the economy hired, there was a lot of demand. We were still working off the labor shortage. What's happened since the prior administration changed their policy, as you mentioned, immigration has fallen very sharply, and therefore the growth of workers has really stopped. It's really stagnant. But at the same time, demand has also fallen. And so demand for workers, so payroll job creation has also fallen. And they've kind of fallen in tandem, which is why the unemployment rate has been pretty stable for about a year. In a way, demand and coincidentally, perhaps to some extent, demand and supply for workers has fallen. In terms of the effect on the labor market, right now we're still at full employment, and labor force participation is still strong. Wages have moved back down to levels that are now pretty sustainable, given an assumption about productivity. So the labor market's in a really good place. Longer term, the effects of immigration are not thought to matter much for inflation. The effects on demand and supply will more or less cancel each other out. So we wouldn't expect there to be a big impact on inflation.
You've seen in recent weeks substantial talk about layoffs in government, as well as freezes in research establishments and universities in jobs. How soon and how big will this be in its impact on labor markets?
So it's too soon to say, but what I can say is, of course, the people being laid off in government is highly significant to them. We don't know how big that's going to be. Right now, it's not big enough to affect a workforce of 170 million people materially. In terms of the cutbacks in funding for science and things like that, we do see in areas, particularly in cities that have a lot of universities and research hospitals and research institutions, we're really hearing significant layoffs and significant impacts on unemployment. I don't know how much that will total up to. And of course, in addition, cutting back on scientific research may have implications for economic growth, for productivity, for health, for all kinds of things. But those are very difficult to estimate in real time.
Now, given that we're talking about the future, you may be confronted in the not so distant future with both higher levels of unemployment as well as potentially higher inflation. And of course, the policies that each one requires will be different. You talked a little bit at the podium about how the Fed would see these two and how it would address it. Just giving you a chance again to elaborate on that.
Right. So most of the time, when the economy is weak, inflation is low, and unemployment is high, and both of those call for lower interest rates to support activity and vice versa. So most of the time, the two goals are not in tension, and they're not really in tension now. The labor market is still strong, but the shock that we're experiencing, the impulses we're feeling, are for higher unemployment and higher inflation, and our tool only does one of those two things at the same time. So it's a difficult place for central banks, to be in terms of what to do. And so the best we can do is we actually have a little provision in our consensus statement, the thing that we vote on to embody how we approach these questions. What we say is we will look at how far the economy is from each of those two goals, and then we'll ask, might there be different paces at which they would approach those goals? We'll look at those things and think about them, and will no doubt be a very difficult judgment. Again, we're not experiencing that now, but we could well be in that situation, as I mentioned in our remarks.
Just want to pick up on a word that is often used today, uncertainty. As a respondent to a Dallas Fed survey said, I've never felt more uncertainty about my business in my entire 40+ years career. The worry today is not just about immediate policy uncertainty, but an entire change in the US's economic philosophy. Not just policy uncertainty, so to speak, but structural uncertainty. Now, one of the effects, as you pointed out, of high levels of uncertainty is that firms postpone investment. For instance, even after the tariffs stabilize, firms that contemplate reshoring production facilities will hesitate, not knowing that the tariffs will be reversed in the future, maybe by the next administration. How do you take such longer term uncertainty into account in your policies?
So let me just agree that what comes back very strongly, and everyone will understand this. These are very fundamental changes in long held, in some cases, policies in the United States, and there's not any real experience. I mean, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were actually not this large, and they were 95 years ago. So there isn't a modern experience to think about this. And businesses and households are saying in surveys that they are experiencing incredibly high uncertainty. There's a lot of research, some of it from the Fed, showing that does lead to businesses and households stepping back from decisions, which of course makes common sense. And you hope that that's something that you go through a phase and then you know what things become more certain, and therefore people can resume normal economic activities given their understanding of what is normal. Your question really is, what if the uncertainty remains high? I think that's a difficult environment. I think people's expected rates of return would have to be higher. I think people would be that would weigh on to me investment just in general. If the United States were to become a jurisdiction where risks are just structurally higher going forward, that would make us less attractive as a jurisdiction. We don't know that at this point, but I think that would be the effect.
Well, let me turn to financial markets. We've seen some volatility, especially stock market volatility. I mean, the levels of the VIX are up to the levels they were at in the early days of the pandemic, coming off somewhat now. Some people believe the Fed will intervene if the stock market plummets, the so-called Fed put. Are they correct?
I'm going to say no with an explanation. So what I think is going on in markets is markets are processing what's going on, and it's really the policies, particularly the trade policy, and really the question is, where is that going to come in? Where's that going to land? And we don't know that yet. And until we know that, we can't really make informed assessments that would still be highly uncertain once you know what the policy is, still be highly uncertain what the economic effects will be. So markets are struggling with a lot of uncertainty, and that means volatility. But having said that, markets are functioning, conditional on being in such a challenging situation. Markets are doing what they're supposed to do. They're orderly and they're functioning just about as you would expect them to function.
So we've seen volatility also in the bond market, and at a time when usually there's a flight to safety. We saw yields on the German bond and the Japanese government bond come down, but we saw yields on U.S. Treasuries go up. What do you attribute this to?
So I would just say the same thing. I think it's very hard to know in real time. I've had a lot of experience with significant moves, for example, in the bond market, where there's a narrative that people land on, and then 2 months later you look back and go, that was completely wrong. So I think it's very premature to say exactly what's going on. Clearly, there's some delevering going on among hedge funds, leverage trades and things like that. It's also, again, it's the market's processing historically unique developments, and with great uncertainty. And I think you'll probably see continued volatility. But I wouldn't try to be definitive about exactly what's causing that. I would just say markets are orderly and they're functioning kind of as you would expect them to in times of uncertainty.
So the Fed, in its last meeting, slowed the pace of the balance sheet. Was this driven by uncertainty about how much reserves and liquidity the market needed at once? The market was orderly. What if market disruptions emerged with the Fed intervening?
So we think that reserves are still abundant. So we don't think we're close to the point, particularly close to the point where we would stop. But we were facing a situation in which for other reasons, there were going to be big flows into and out of reserves because it had to do with the debt ceiling and Treasury in general. For those of you who are Treasury market people, but while those big flows were happening over a period of 6 months, we would actually be shielded from being able to see evidence that we were or were not getting close to the level less abundant reserves. And so we decided to slow the pace. We thought about pausing, and instead we debated one of the great debates that we had at the FOMC. We decided to slow the pace instead, and people really came to see the merits of that because the slower we go, the less the smaller the balance sheet can get without disruption. And we want that process to continue, and now it's at quite a slow pace. So we think that's a really good thing. So that means we can go on for a longer amount of time, and we'll be able to reach kind of very carefully what we think is the right level of reserves. Still plenty of reserves.
What about the international dollar base? Uh, with all these disruptions, uh, do you stand ready to supply dollars to the central banks as you've done in the past when there's been a global shortage of dollars?
Sure, absolutely we do. Just for everyone's knowledge, we have standing dollar swap lines with 5 large central banks, and they go to the jurisdictions where there are big overseas dollar funding markets. And in fact, those are overseas markets where, for example, a European or Asian institution is buying an asset-backed security that is backed by loans to American consumers. So in fact, these are loans to American consumers, and we support that. We want to make sure that dollars are available. They need dollar funding to hold those dollar assets. So the way it works is, when needed, we lend to the central bank in dollars, and they pay us back in dollars. They then pay in their currency. They lend on in dollars, and so we take no credit risk or anything like that. It supports dollar funding markets. Dollar funding markets are very sensitive during times of crisis, very sensitive. The reason we do it is it's really good for U.S. consumers. So we'll continue to do that, just as part of the dollar being a reserve currency. The reserve currency is important, and we will do that.
You mentioned amongst the issues you were focusing on was the U.S. fiscal situation. Well, clearly, U.S. sovereign debt continues to rise. And what are your thoughts on the longer term implications for interest rates and economic stability? How much further can we go in terms of national debt before we cross a line that might sustain a
So U.S. federal debt is on an unsustainable path. It's not at an unsustainable level, and no one really knows how much further we can go. Other countries over time have gone much farther, but we're now, we're running very large deficits at full employment, and this is a situation that we very much need to address. Sooner or later, we'll have to, and sooner is better than later. In terms of, if I can say from my time working on these issues, it's not the Fed's issue, but if you look at the pie chart of federal spending, the biggest parts that are growing are Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and now interest payments. And so that's really where the work has to be done. And those are issues that can only be touched on a bipartisan basis. Neither party can figure out what to do without both parties being at the table. So that's critical. All of this domestic discretionary spending, which is essentially where 100% of the conversation is small as a percentage of federal spending, and is declining. It's already declining as a percentage of federal spending. So when people are focusing on cutting domestic spending, they're not actually working on the problem. Domestic discretionary spending is already going down. I like to make that point because so much of the dialogue that the politicians offer is about domestic discretionary spending, which is not the issue.
Well, let's turn to stability and regulation. Turning to the U.S. financial sector, we still have some concerns about distressed commercial real estate loans on bank balance sheets, whether they've been fully dealt with so far. There's some sense that they haven't. Add to that the very rapid growth in various forms of private credit over the last few years, which arguably haven't been tested by a full-blown recession. How would you put the resilience of our financial institutions at this point and their ability to weather potentially uncertain times?
So I think our banking system is well capitalized with liquidity and is quite resilient right now to the kinds of shocks that it may face. I do believe that. In terms of the commercial real estate, there are, and this has been the case really, we've been working on this for 4 or 5 years now. There are some banks, it's mostly medium and small size banks who have elevated concentrations of commercial real estate. Some have been troubled, and we've been working to make sure that those banks have a plan, capital, and absorb the losses that they're doing. So that's been going on for some time. The very largest banks don't tend to have high concentration, So this is a problem that we have known would take years to work through. We're really well into the process of working through it. In terms of non-bank financial sector, it's grown enormously. The provision of credit by non-banks has grown just really fast. Most of it has been funded, though, with a private equity-like structure where it's limited partners who are signed up for 10 years to a general partner to invest that money. They're not depositors who can run. Your money is committed, and that funding model is kind of run proof. That isn't some law of nature. So you do start to see shorter term funding creeping in. And to your point, though, Roger, this very fast growing and now quite large private credit part of the economy has not really been through a significant credit event or significant. It's really grown since the pandemic. And so just for that reason and for how fast it's growing, we have a close eye on it. It doesn't have the same kind of financial regulation that the banking system has. So we're watching it carefully. And as I mentioned, it's a more stable funding source to the extent it's institutional investors signed up for a long period. But we're watching carefully.
Right. Where in my banking research happened, actually banks are also involved in these institutions in a big way. We do know the administration wants to relax regulations in many areas, one of which may well be banking. What can you tell us about the Basel III endgame, so to speak, which is at this point primarily focused on additional capital for the large banks?
The Fed view, in my view, is that we should proceed to complete the Basel III accord, and we would have to do that, and we look forward to doing that in conjunction with the FDIC and the OCC. But our view is, and I think the bank's view as well, is we should complete that. We need international minimum standards. That's kind of a common good, and we're not bound by them. Really, nothing. The United States has plenty of input into what those accords contain. So our view is strongly that we should complete this, and we can do it, I think, relatively quickly. We're not so very far away from what would be a good, I think, outcome.
Well, let me move to something which is more about technological change and new kinds of instruments, cryptocurrencies. How do you see the potential for more favorable regulations coming on them, and potential risks from that for the system?
So we went through a wave of failures and fraud and things like that were the headlines for a couple of years. And I think what you see now is during that period, by the way, we worked with Congress to try to get a framework, a legal framework for stable coins, which would have been a nice place to start. We were not successful. I think that the climate is changing, and you're moving into sort of more mainstreaming of that whole sector. So Congress is again looking at both the Senate and the House are looking at a framework, a legal framework for stable coins. Depending on what's in it, that's a good idea. We need that. There isn't one now. And stable coins are a product, a digital product that could actually have fairly wide appeal and should contain consumer protections of the typical sorts and transparency. And that's what the Senate and the House are working on. So that's a positive thing. I also think some of the we took a pretty conservative, and other bank regulators took an even more conservative perspective on how the guidance and the rules we impose on banks. I think there'll be some loosening of that, and I think we'll try to do it in a way that preserves safety and soundness, but that permits and fosters appropriate innovation, but that does so in a way that again doesn't put consumers at risk in ways they don't understand or make banks less safe and sound.
You have a policy review underway. Now, surveys recently tell us there seems to be a distinction between a rise in the level of prices which is what the public seems to worry a lot about. And the rate of increase in prices, which certainly they worry about in passing, but the Fed worries much more about. That is the rate of inflation. So even though we're coming down to 2%, people remember that over the last few years, it's been over 20% increase in prices. So as you start thinking about the policy review, is there any thought about how we might want to address this sort of challenge that it's the path of prices as much as the rate of change which matters?
First of all, I think you're right, and I think the public is right. But when we say inflation is back down to 2%, 2.5%, and we think that's a good thing, it is a good thing. But if you're paying 20% more than you were paying in 2021, that doesn't help you much. You're still paying a lot more than you used to be paying for the necessities of life. So it's just another way of saying people hate inflation, and it's easy to understand why. What all we can really control is a world in which, in the world we're living in, prices don't go down in the aggregate except in extreme times that we don't want to court. So I don't think we couldn't have a framework where we're going to bring prices down by 10%. That's not something we'll be looking at. We're essentially looking at the best way to foster 2% inflation over time. And the things we did back in the changes we made in 2020 were really innovations around what to do when you're stuck near zero. Now we're well above zero, and it may be that we still need to have in our framework a way to deal with that, but perhaps the main case is not one where you're dealing with the effective lower bound. That would be a framework that looks a lot more like the one that we had before 2020.
Now, one of the tools you brought in to deal with the zero lower bound was quantitative easing. But you've also used quantitative easing to fix disruptions in the financial markets. Are you going to be more specific about what your objective is with quantitative easing as you go through this review?
So in the beginning, it's typically we're using it for financial market function. That was the case with the global financial crisis and the pandemic. And we did try to explain ourselves through the pandemic, and our explanations changed. But I think it's fair to say we might have done a better job of being clear about why we were doing that. That's something that we're aware of and looking at.
I mean, no discussion is complete without talking about AI. With AI coming fast and furious, it could affect productivity, it could affect employment. There are some people who say we will see for the first time technological unemployment in a serious way with AI. What are your thoughts about it, and how will it impact the Fed going forward?
So, like everyone who's been exposed to what it's capable of, it's beyond. I started about thinking about it as like a better version of Google, but it's not. It's like a better version of a person. It can do amazing things, and so the question is, all through the 250 years of technological innovation, technology evolves, and people worry that it's going to replace human labor and people will be unemployed. And that hasn't been the case. Or it may be the case in the short run. In the long run, what it's done is raise human productivity and therefore living standards. So is this going to be the case where it eliminates more jobs than it creates? And we just don't know. You come back in 20 years, will it be the case that just people are much more productive in their work because of AI? Or will it be the case that AI has just replaced a lot of people? And I think it's very hard to say, but it truly is remarkable in what it's capable of. We had a demonstration by a Wharton professor recently, and you speak to it like a person, and it kind of responds like a person. And the things that it can do are really amazing. And by the way, this is early days. They're talking about even the next couple of years will bring more dramatic breakthroughs. So I think it's one of the two or three things most likely to bring dramatic change to the economy all around the world in the 20 years, I'd say very hard to say how it shakes out.
Let me turn to your job. An important man once said of your job, it's the greatest job in government. You show up to office once a month and you say, let's see, flip a coin. And then everybody talks about you like you're a god. What is it that you normally do every day in the office? Is it fulfilling and, dare I say, enjoyable? And you really feel like a god.
So I would agree. I think it's the best job in government. I really do enjoy it. Yes, I love the job. It's a great honor to serve. It's quite humbling because everybody makes mistakes. It's just the economy is just not predictable. So all of that is true, and I do what everybody expects me to do. We do a little more reading though as part of our daily. My colleagues and I do part of our daily regime than a typical executive would do. In terms of being a god, I would say that we are blessed with a large number of amply compensated critics who would kind of tend to undercut that. So we don't feel like a god.
So let me go to the more mundane. In that office, what are the key indicators you look for? What are the sources of data that you go through as you try and make up your mind?
So I'd say start with labor. There's more labor market data and more better reliable labor market data than probably anywhere else, and it's just a lot of data. It's new jobs, payroll, it's wages, it's participation. You can break all of those down into different categories. It's a million different things. So there's a lot of labor market data. It's a great field if you're going into economics because there's just so much to do. So then we look at the inflation data. Also, I keep track of global developments pretty carefully, and I talk to my global counterparts pretty regularly just to stay aware of what's going on. Financial markets are really important, and lately it's something that we're paying close attention to, as you would expect. What's going on around the world in currency markets, and fixed income markets, and equity markets. All of that. For me, though, my background was more in the private sector, and as an investor, and for a significant part of my career. And I have to talk to outsiders about what they're seeing and what they're dealing with for it to really kind of fit together for me. I can look at only so much data, and but to really get the story and the narrative, it's more talking to outsiders, and anecdotal data does help things kind of fit together for me, I would say.
Told us about speaking with business people last night and getting a sense of what was going on in the Midwest. Let me turn to Fed independence. You've reiterated that you intend to stay in office until the end of your term, and that certainly reassured many in financial markets. What are the levers the government or the legislature have to pressure the Fed? And should one worry about threats to the Fed's independence once you're gone?
So our independence is a matter of law. Congress says in our statute we're not removable except for cause. We serve very long terms, seemingly endless terms. We're protected in the law. So Congress could change that law, but I don't think there's any danger of that. That independence has pretty broad support across both political parties and in both sides of the Hill. So I think that's not a problem. There's a Supreme Court case people will have read probably in today's journal, in which the Supreme Court may decide whether independent agencies generally, whether they're authorizing laws, can contain a provision that prevents the president from firing members of a commission other than for cause. And that's a case that people are talking about.
Ha dicho Jerome Powell que no va a bajar las tasas de interés. ¿Qué significa esto?
You've seen fast payouts. Let funded show you even faster why.
¿Qué significa esto? Que el dólar posiblemente se siga debilitando. Yo creo que con ese comentario Vamos a tener un dólar bajista.
Political pressure. People can say whatever they want. That's
Vamos a mirar.
not a problem. But we will do what we do strictly without consideration of political or any other restraint.
Bueno, aún sigue en rango, pero eso es una noticia muy negativa para él. Ese fue el viejo.
Well, I have time for one more question. I know the question that's on all your minds. What are you going to do on interest rates next? But I'm not sure if it's, and I'm not sure you will tell even you. So, I'm not going to ask that question. But the question I want to ask is a more personal one. What is it that you like to do most at home after an exhausting day flipping coins in the office?
I play my one of my guitars. I do Zoom calls with my kids and grandkids, and I go to the gym a lot too, just to stay in shape.
We need you healthy. We need you healthy. Thank you very much, Powell.
Thank you.
And please join me.
En directo cuando son las 8:22 hora central europea, termina la intervención del presidente de la Reserva Federal, Jerome Powell, ante el Club Económico de Chicago. Ha dejado bastantes titulares el presidente de la Reserva Federal que no están sentando nada bien a Wall Street, porque Jerome Powell reconoce que los efectos de los aranceles van a ser más intensos de lo que inicialmente pronosticaba la Reserva Federal, porque dice que los propios aranceles en sí son más graves de lo que inicialmente se creía. Dice que esos aranceles van a afectar de forma inicial a la inflación de corto plazo,
El daño que le hizo la...
las expectativas sobre la inflación a más largo plazo sí que se mantienen bien ancladas. El presidente de la FED también ha lanzado un titular llamativo en torno al mundo de las criptomonedas. Reconoce Jerome Powell que el sector cripto quizá deba someterse a un proceso de regulación
puta, hoy. Tuvo que haber caído. Tuvo que haber caído.
Y que un marco legal para las
Oiga.
sería una buena idea. También ha hablado de la inteligencia artificial, ha dicho que es un desafío, pero que no va a
Claro.
desestructurar el mercado del trabajo en un contexto como el actual, y también dice que, por cierto, que el sector financiero está bien empleado a pesar de las posibles disrupciones que puedan provocar esos impactos arancelarios. Vamos a ver cómo está cotizando el mercado, porque volvemos a observar sangría en la renta variable norteamericana, en Wall Street, miedo a que esa guerra comercial esté lejos de resolverse, mientras pues el presidente de la Reserva Federal, Jerome Powell, ha echado más leña al fuego, y eso se está notando en Wall Street. A esta hora, índices de renta variable de Estados Unidos ya experimentan caídas superiores al 3% en el caso del índice tecnológico Nasdaq. Pierde un 3,16, cotiza en los 18.234 puntos. S&P 500 cae un 2,2, marca 5.278 puntos. Por detrás tenemos a Dow Jones, es el índice que menos está retrocediendo en la sesión de hoy, cae un 1,45 y cotiza en los 39.776 puntos. Jornada en la que el color rojo ha sido el protagonista de toda la sesión, sobre todo con una tecnología que está sufriendo después de que las compañías hayan hecho cálculos sobre el impacto que van a tener en sus cuentas de resultados el hecho de que Estados Unidos vaya a limitar las exportaciones a China. Por eso tenemos a Nvidia como el farolillo rojo de la sesión, experimentando una auténtica sangría. En tiempo real cotiza con caídas cercanas ya al 9% en los $102,36. AMD, por lo mismo, en el caso de Nvidia dice que va a perder 5.500 millones de dólares, AMD dice que va a perder 800, tenemos a la compañía cayendo más de un 8% en los $87,50. Les voy a contar rápidamente cuáles son las claves del día, cuál es el foco de los inversores en una jornada en la que los inversores, como decimos, están muy pendientes del mercado de renta variable, pero también de otros mercados. La guerra comercial entre Estados Unidos y China se recrudece mientras la imposición arancelaria por parte de Donald Trump sobre el gigante asiático ya es del 245%. Las partes hablan de la necesidad de diálogo, pero de momento ese diálogo no se produce. Por cierto, estamos pendientes de Donald Trump, que hoy celebra una reunión él personalmente con la delegación de Japón en busca del primer acuerdo arancelario. Mientras, como les decimos, el presidente de la Fed, Jerome Powell, echa leña al fuego, dice que el impacto de los aranceles será mayor porque los aranceles en sí mismos son superiores a lo esperado. Y en este contexto hay dos grandes ganadores de la jornada. Por un lado, el petróleo, que está experimentando avances moderados en este contexto de mayor recrudecimiento de la guerra comercial entre China y Estados Unidos, con un crudo que está experimentando avances del entorno del 1,5%. El barril de referencia en Europa cotiza con avances del 1,5%, unos $65 con 80. El West Texas de referencia en Estados Unidos también experimenta avances de carácter similar. De hecho, si vemos los futuros del crudo, vemos cómo avanzan un 1,6 por encima de los $62. Pero el gran ganador de la jornada es el oro, el principal metal precioso, brilla hoy con luz propia porque no solamente ha conseguido un máximo histórico nuevo, sino dos. Uno esta mañana por encima de los $3.300 la onza y otro por la tarde por encima de los 3.332. A esta hora el oro cotiza pues ya cerca de los 3.350, 3.348 con avances del 3,3%. Auténtico rally el que está viviendo el metal precioso. Vamos a actualizar las últimas horas empezando pues por esos mensajes que ha dejado el presidente de la Reserva Federal en su acto ante el Club Económico de Chicago. Y es que Jerome Powell ha lanzado una advertencia directa a Donald Trump. Dice que el impacto inflacionario de los aranceles del presidente de Estados Unidos va a ser más persistente de lo previsto. Evitar ese resultado dependerá de la magnitud de los efectos, de cuánto tiempo tarden en trasladarse completamente a los precios y, en última instancia, de mantener las expectativas de inflación a largo plazo bien ancladas. Eso dice que de momento se está manteniendo. Sin embargo, dice Jerome Powell que de momento la Fed está bien posicionada para esperar a que haya mayor claridad antes de considerar cualquier ajuste a la postura política de la Reserva Federal. Dice Powell que siguen analizando los datos que se están publicando, la evolución de las perspectivas y el balance de riesgos, pero alerta, podríamos encontrarnos en un escenario complejo en el que nuestros objetivos de doble mandato se vean en conflicto. Si esto ocurriera, consideraríamos la distancia a la que se encuentra la economía respecto a cada objetivo y los posibles diferentes horizontes temporales en los que se anticipa que se cerrarán esas respectivas brechas. Dice Powell que los aranceles son mayores y que, por lo tanto, el impacto de la economía de Estados Unidos también va a ser mayor.
Tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated. The level of tariff increases announced so far is significantly larger than anticipated, and the same is likely to be true of the economic effects, which will include higher inflation and slower growth. Both survey and market-based measures of near-term inflation expectations have moved up significantly, with survey participants pointing to tariffs. Survey measures of longer-term inflation expectations, for the most part, appear to remain well anchored as well. Market-based break-evens continue to run close to 2%.
Contamos también que la Oficina de Aduanas y Protección Fronteriza de Estados Unidos ha ofrecido hoy cifras actualizadas sobre la recaudación arancelaria de Donald Trump que desmentirían las afirmaciones del presidente de Estados Unidos, que dice que esos aranceles han conseguido una recaudación de casi 2.000 millones de dólares en ingresos al día. Según un comunicado compartido con CNBC, este organismo oficial confirma que desde el 5 de abril se han recaudado más de 500 millones de dólares en virtud de los nuevos aranceles recíprocos, lo que ha contribuido a más de 21.000 millones de dólares en ingresos procedentes de 15 medidas comerciales presidenciales implementadas desde el 20 de enero. Esto se produce, recordemos, tras un error reciente que les contamos del sistema de cobro de los aranceles que interrumpió durante un tiempo el proceso de exención para ciertas importaciones. A pesar del problema técnico, los ingresos de la CBP se han mantenido en un promedio de 250 millones de dólares diarios. Además, datos del Departamento del Tesoro publicados a principios de esta semana han hablado de una recaudación diaria de 305 millones de dólares en aduanas y ciertos impuestos especiales, lo que revela una brecha significativa entre esos ingresos reales por varias fuentes oficiales y las afirmaciones de Donald Trump, que insiste en que se reciben 2.000 millones de dólares al día. Y vamos a contarles otra noticia de última hora que tiene todo el sentido del mundo en el marco de la guerra comercial entre Estados Unidos y China y en el intento de controlar al sector tecnológico por parte del presidente Donald Trump. Les contamos que la administración Trump ha anunciado la toma de medidas enérgicas y contundentes contra la compañía china DeepSeek y su proveedor estadounidense de chips, Nvidia. Es decir, Estados Unidos pretende que Nvidia no sea el vendedor de chips de DeepSeek. Según ha informado el New York Times, citando a tres fuentes familiarizadas con el asunto, Washington está considerando sanciones que impedirían a DeepSeek adquirir tecnología estadounidense y está discutiendo prohibir a los estadounidenses acceder a sus servicios, según publica, como decimos, el diario New York Times. El Comité Selecto de la Cámara de Representantes sobre Competencia Estratégica de Estados Unidos y el Partido Comunista Chino han iniciado una investigación sobre las ventas de chips de Nvidia a Asia con el objetivo de esclarecer si el fabricante de chips puso a disposición de DeepSeek tecnología crítica a sabiendas, violando la normativa estadounidense. Nvidia ha revelado anteriormente que prevé pérdidas, lo acabamos de contar, de 5.500 millones de dólares en ventas después de que Estados Unidos impusiera restricciones a las exportaciones de chips al gigante asiático. Vamos a hablar precisamente del recrudecimiento de esta guerra comercial. José Antonio Burpegui, catedrático de estudios norteamericanos en la Universidad de Alcalá, director del Instituto. Bienvenido. Pues, José Antonio, quiero hablar contigo de ese recrudecimiento de la guerra. Parece que las partes dicen que están dispuestas a hablar. Cierto es que hoy hemos tenido avances. Por un lado, por el lado estadounidense se ha confirmado que la imposición de aranceles ahora es del 245% a China, y del lado chino se habla de la posibilidad de negociar siempre y cuando dicen desde el gobierno haya respeto y han nombrado pues a una nueva persona que será la encargada de llevar a cabo esas negociaciones. Ciertos avances, pero las posturas están más alejadas que nunca y yo creo que el miedo es cada vez mayor porque ahora ya sí que tenemos a los dos gigantes absolutamente enfrentados.
Sí, bueno, sí. Yo creo que llevan enfrentados en mucho tiempo, ¿no? Pero digamos que ahora ya, digamos que las hostilidades están definitivamente abiertas y encima de la mesa. No sé, tal vez yo hoy pensaba si teníamos cuando ya, digamos que China prohíbe, paraliza la compra de aviones Boeing, Estados Unidos sigue ampliando momento para que, bueno, me da la sensación de los dos, tanto en Estados Unidos como en China, y empiecen a negociar, ¿no? Y no sé, pues también escuchaba unas declaraciones también, no sé si fueron ayer o antes de ayer, del presidente Donald Trump, que decía que China era como cualquier otra nación, o sea, que la política con China era como cualquier otra, lo único que era más grande, ¿no? Bien, bueno, creo que ese es el lenguaje de Trump, que ya estamos acostumbrados, pero obviamente China pues no es lo mismo que cualquier otra nación, no es lo mismo que Luxemburgo precisamente. Tal vez sea bueno ya que se llegue a esta situación, al menos también el portavoz chino, el gobierno chino, ha dicho que tienen que negociar, pero también Donald Trump, lo mismo que dijo, lo mismo que había dicho esa declaración, también dijo otra hace poco que tiene que sentarse a negociar con China. Yo creo que ya ha llegado el momento, ¿no? Que los dos se sienten a negociar y veamos cuál es ese punto de encuentro. La noticia, creo, me ha parecido que también la has comentado tú, que mañana se va a ver Donald Trump con Japón. Creo que también lo he leído por ahí, pero también lo has dicho. tiene que ver, yo pienso con, no lo he seguido, pero parece ser que China podría estar vendiendo bonos de deuda de Estados Unidos. Me imagino que esas negociaciones de Trump con Japón, no vemos que Japón es el principal tenedor de deuda norteamericana por encima de China, ¿no? Pues tiene que ver tal vez con todo eso, con esos movimientos estratégicos que creo que están haciendo los dos, tanto China como Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y bueno, hay tantos factores que entran a colación en esta pelea, ¿no? que resulta tremendamente compleja. Por una parte, yo puedo entender la filosofía paraguas de Donald Trump en cuanto a sus relaciones con China, que dominan absolutamente todo, dominan también sus relaciones con otras naciones, ¿no? Donald Trump, por una parte, ve las relaciones con China, los dos pilares desde mi punto de vista sería, por una parte, el ver o el entender que China se está convirtiendo en la gran potencia mundial, está subiendo Estados Unidos, que fue en el siglo XX, lo mismo que fue en España, fue en el siglo XVIII y en el siglo XXI. Lo está haciendo, no sé si terminará por serlo definitivamente China, y eso quiere, por una parte, pararlo, es decir, quiere mantener el status quo con Estados Unidos como gran potencia mundial, y por otra parte, lo que intenta es detener esa política tan agresiva de China, que es preocupante. China, digamos que en esta contienda, muchos ven Trump es el malo y China es el bueno, no es bueno. Desde el sistema político que tiene hasta esa política expansionista de China, que está acaparando absolutamente todo, está acaparando todos los recursos agrícolas. Un tema muy importante para la nación, ¿no? Pero los medios de comunicación hablo de poca claridad en cuanto a cómo está la inflación y cómo va a impactar la economía. Jerome Powell definitivamente cuando hablaba de Panamá estaba focalizado en cómo China está haciendo con la televisión. Yo estuve hace 4 años, 4 años en Sri Lanka. Recuerdo que el puerto de Colombo estaban haciendo los chinos, estaban haciendo geopolítica, la entrada del mar. Es decir, esa agresividad que está teniendo China para hacerse con los medios de distribución, con los recursos mundiales, pues es preocupante. Tenemos que preocuparnos y creo que es eso que le preocupa a Donald Trump. Entendiendo eso, y ya termino, es cierto que las formas de Donald Trump, pues creo que es lo que le están perdiendo. Creo que la forma que Donald Trump está teniendo de atajar lo que él entiende que va a ser el gran problema del siglo XXI, tanto para Estados Unidos como para el mundo, que va a ser China, lo que podemos estar de acuerdo o podemos entenderlo, si se prefiere, la forma de atajarlo o la forma de combatirlo, creo que no está siendo precisamente la más oportuna o la más correcta.
Preguntar por si crees que Donald Trump va a recibir algún tipo de presión por el sector tecnológico norteamericano, teniendo en cuenta que un gigante como Nvidia está cayendo de bolsa casi un 9%, porque Trump pretende dividir la venta de sus chips a China. Acabamos de saber que pretende prohibir que le venda nada de chip, incluso que el chip opere en Estados Unidos. ¿Hasta qué punto eso va a ser utilizado como medida de presión por parte de los tecnológicos?
Bueno, yo no sé hasta qué punto Donald Trump aguanta la presión, cuando digo aguanta la presión, aguanta que alguien le presione, ¿no? Y lo tenemos visto en infinidad de actuaciones, ¿no? Incluso otra que no tiene nada que ver directamente con esto, pero todo el tema que lleva ahora con la Universidad de Harvard, con las grandes universidades norteamericanas, se enfrenta a ellos sin ningún problema. Entonces yo no sé hasta qué punto él haría caso a esas presiones. Obviamente no se pueden negar esas presiones. Yo creo que esas presiones de los lobbies no llegarían directamente a él, sino que muy probablemente las presiones lleguen o bien por congresistas o bien por miembros de su gabinete en esas dos tendencias que hay en su propio gabinete, por una parte los